In a small village nestled deep in the Nigerian countryside, there lived a woman named Mary. She was known throughout the community for her kindness and her delicious palm wine, but despite 8 years of marriage to her loving husband John, Mary remained childless. Every day, Mary would watch as the other women in the village carried their babies on their backs or held the hands of their little ones. Her heart ached with longing, and her nights were often filled with tears. One day, unable to bear the pain any longer, Mary decided to visit the sacred river that flowed at the edge of their village. It was said that the river god, known as Old Father Thames, had the power to grant wishes to those who were pure of heart. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow across the water, Mary knelt at the riverbank. She dipped her hands into the cool water and began to pray. "Oh, great Old Father Thames," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I come to you with a heavy heart. For 8 long years, I have waited and hoped for a child of my own. Please, I beg you, hear my prayer and bless me with a baby." As Mary prayed, she felt a strange sensation in the water. The surface began to ripple, even though there was no wind. Suddenly, a deep voice echoed across the river. "Mary," the voice boomed, "I have heard your prayers. Your heart is pure, and your desire is true. I will grant you a child, but this child will be special. He will have the gift of sight beyond what normal eyes can see. With this gift, he will bring both joy and sorrow, peace and conflict to your village. Do you accept this child, knowing the challenges that may come?" Without hesitation, Mary nodded. "Yes, Old Father Thames. I accept this child with all my heart." The voice spoke again. "Very well. In 9 moons' time, you will give birth to a son. But remember this, when he reaches his 30th year, he must return to me. This is the price of the gift I give. Do you still accept?" Mary's heart clenched at the thought of losing her child after only 30 years, but the desire to be a mother was too strong. "I accept," she said firmly. As soon as the words left her lips, the water stilled, and the voice faded away. Mary stood up, her legs shaky but her heart full of hope. She hurried home to tell her husband the news. 9 months later, just as Old Father Thames had promised, Mary gave birth to a healthy baby boy. But as soon as the midwife placed the child in Mary's arms, everyone in the room gasped. The baby's eyes were enormous, taking up nearly half of his tiny face. "What's wrong with him?" John asked, his voice filled with concern. Mary, however, smiled down at her son. "Nothing is wrong," she said softly. "He's perfect. This is the gift from Old Father Thames." They named the boy Thomas, and as he grew, his eyes remained unusually large. At first, the villagers were wary of the strange-looking child, but Thomas's sweet nature soon won him over. He was a kind and curious boy, always eager to help others and learn new things. It wasn't until Thomas's 5th birthday that they discovered the true nature of his gift. He was playing in the village square when he suddenly stopped and pointed at old Mr. Brown, who was walking by. "Mr. Brown," Thomas called out, "why did you hide your wife's necklace under the floorboards? She's been looking for it for weeks." Mr. Brown's face turned pale. How did you know that?" he stammered. Thomas shrugged. "I can see it," he said simply. "I can see lots of things." From that day on, it became clear that Thomas's giant eyes allowed him to see things that others couldn't. He could see into the past, watching events unfold as if they were happening right in front of him. He could also see the truth behind people's actions, peering into their hearts and minds. As Thomas grew older, he began to use his gift to help the village. He would find lost items, settle disputes by revealing the truth, and even predict coming weather patterns by observing subtle changes in the environment that others couldn't see. But with his growing influence came growing attention, and not all of it was positive. Some of the village elders, particularly those who had long held power through corruption and deceit, began to view Thomas as a threat. By the time Thomas reached his teenage years, the village had become divided. Many loved and respected him for his honesty and helpfulness, but others feared and resented his ability to uncover their secrets. Little did Thomas know that his greatest challenges were yet to come, as the forces of corruption and evil in the village began to plot against him. As Thomas entered his teenage years, his reputation spread far beyond the borders of his small village. People from neighboring towns would often make the journey to seek his advice or ask him to solve mysteries that had long puzzled them. With each passing day, Thomas's gift grew stronger, and his ability to see both past and present became sharper. One sweltering summer afternoon, when Thomas was 15, a group of strangers arrived in the village. They were led by a man named Robert, who claimed to be a wealthy merchant from the city. Robert's clothes were fine, and his pockets jingled with gold coins, but there was something about his eyes that made Thomas uneasy. As the villagers gathered to greet the newcomers, Thomas stood back, his large eyes scanning the group. Suddenly, he gasped. In his mind's eye, he saw flashes of dark rituals, blood-stained altars, and terrified young girls being dragged away from their homes. Without thinking, Thomas called out, "Stop! These men are not what they seem." The villagers turned to look at him, confusion written on their faces. Robert's smile faltered for a moment before he regained his composure. "What nonsense is this?" Robert laughed, but there was a hint of nervousness in his voice. "We are simple merchants, boy. Nothing more." Thomas stepped forward, his giant eyes fixed on Robert. "I see the truth," he said firmly. "You are members of a cult that sacrifices innocent girls. You've come here looking for new victims." A hush fell over the crowd. Some of the villagers looked skeptical, while others began to back away from the strangers in fear. Robert's face darkened with anger. "How dare you spread such lies?" he shouted. "This boy is clearly cursed. Look at his unnatural eyes. He's trying to turn you against honest travelers." But Thomas stood his ground. "If you're innocent, then you won't mind if we search your wagons," he suggested calmly. The village chief, an older man named Samuel, stepped forward. "I think that's a reasonable request," he said. "If you have nothing to hide, surely you won't object." Realizing they were cornered, Robert and his men tried to flee, but the villagers quickly surrounded them. When they searched the wagons, they found hidden compartments containing ritual daggers, strange symbols, and even a list of potential victims from the village. The cult members were promptly tied up and taken to the nearest city to face justice. The villagers celebrated Thomas's bravery and insight, hailing him as a hero. But not everyone was pleased with the outcome. In the shadows, a group of village elders watched the celebration with growing unease. These men had long profited from corruption and backroom deals with outsiders like Robert. They feared that Thomas's gift would eventually expose their own misdeeds. Leading this group was a man named Gregory, who had served as the village's unofficial moneylender for years. His loans came with exorbitant interest rates that often left families destitute, but no one had ever been able to prove his wrongdoing. "This cannot continue," Gregory muttered to his conspirators. "The boy is becoming too powerful. If we don't act soon, all our carefully laid plans will be ruined." One of the other elders, a thin man named Peter, nodded in agreement. "But what can we do? The villagers love him. If we move against him openly, we'll lose everything." Gregory's eyes narrowed as he watched Thomas laughing with his friends. "Then we must turn the village against him," he said coldly. "We'll spread rumors, create doubt, and when the time is right, we'll strike." Over the next few years, Gregory and his allies worked tirelessly to undermine Thomas's influence. They whispered in the ears of the villagers, suggesting that Thomas's gift was actually a curse that brought misfortune to the village. They pointed to the increased attention from outsiders as proof that Thomas was disrupting their peaceful way of life. At first, most villagers dismissed these rumors. They had seen firsthand the good that Thomas had done. But as time went on, and as Gregory's group became more insidious in their tactics, doubt began to creep in. When Thomas was 18, a series of crop failures hit the village. It was a natural disaster, caused by an unusually dry season, but Gregory saw an opportunity. He began to spread the idea that Thomas's unnatural eyes had angered the gods, who were now punishing the entire village. Some of the more superstitious villagers began to avoid Thomas. Children who had once played with him now ran away when they saw him coming. Even some of his closest friends started to question whether his gift was truly a blessing. Through it all, Thomas remained strong. He continued to use his gift to help others, even those who now looked at him with suspicion. He uncovered a plot to steal from the village's communal grain stores, exposed a group of bandits who had been terrorizing travelers on the nearby roads, and even helped deliver a breech baby when the midwife was away. But the whispers continued, growing louder with each passing day. Thomas could see the doubt in people's eyes, could feel the weight of their suspicion. Even his parents, who had always stood by him, began to show signs of worry. One night, as Thomas sat by the river where he had first been granted his gift, he looked up at the stars and whispered, "Old Father Thames, why did you give me these eyes if they were to bring me such pain? How can I help my people if they fear me?" As if in answer, the water began to ripple, and Thomas heard a faint whisper on the wind. "The greatest gifts often come with the greatest challenges," the voice said. "Stay true to your heart, young Thomas. The truth will prevail." Strengthened by these words, Thomas stood up, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Little did he know that Gregory and his conspirators were preparing to make their final move against him, a plan so devious that it would shake the very foundations of the village. As Thomas approached his 20th birthday, the tension in the village reached a boiling point. Gregory and his allies had spent years sowing seeds of doubt and fear, and now they were ready to reap their harvest of distrust. One stormy night, as thunder rolled across the sky, a piercing scream echoed through the village. People rushed from their homes to find Sarah, a young woman who was due to be married the following week, lying unconscious in the village square. Her wedding dress, which she had been sewing, was torn and stained with mud. As the villagers gathered around in confusion and fear, Gregory stepped forward, his face a mask of concern. "Who could have done such a terrible thing?" he asked loudly, his eyes scanning the crowd. Suddenly, Peter, Gregory's accomplice, called out, "I saw someone running from the square just before we found Sarah." It looked like Thomas. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Thomas, who had just arrived at the scene, felt all eyes turn to him. "That's not true," he said firmly. "I was at home with my parents." But doubt had already taken root. People began to murmur, recalling all the rumors and whispers of the past few years. Gregory seized the moment. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice heavy with false sorrow. "We've tolerated the curse in our midst for too long. Those unnatural eyes have brought nothing but misfortune to our village. It's time we purge this evil from our community." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, more angry. Thomas looked around in disbelief, seeing faces that had once smiled at him now twisted with fear and hatred. "Wait," Thomas's father, John, pushed through the crowd. "My son is innocent. He would never harm anyone." But Gregory was prepared for this. "Of course you would defend him," he sneered. "But can you be sure? Can any of us truly know what darkness lurks behind those monstrous eyes?" The situation was spiraling out of control. Some villagers were calling for Thomas to be banished, while others demanded more severe punishment. It was then that Samuel, the village chief, stepped in. "Enough," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We are not savages. If Thomas is to be judged, it will be done properly. We will hold a trial, as our ancestors did, by fire." A hush fell over the crowd. The trial by fire was an ancient tradition, rarely used but still remembered. The accused would be tied to a stake and surrounded by kindling. If they were innocent, it was believed that the gods would intervene and save them from the flames. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine, but he stood tall. "I accept," he said, his voice unwavering. "I have nothing to hide." The trial was set for the following evening. As Thomas was led away to be held until then, he caught sight of Gregory smirking in the shadows. In that moment, with his gift of sight, Thomas saw flashes of Gregory and Peter plotting, staging Sarah's attack, bribing witnesses. He understood then the full extent of the conspiracy against him. But who would believe him now? The next day passed in a blur of fear and preparation. Thomas's parents pleaded with the village elders to reconsider, but their cries fell on deaf ears. As the sun began to set, Thomas was led to the center of the village, where a stake had been erected and surrounded by dry wood and kindling. The villagers gathered around, their faces a mix of anger, fear, and sorrow. Thomas was tied to the stake, the rough ropes digging into his skin. He looked out at the crowd, his large eyes taking in every detail, every expression. "Before we begin," Gregory announced, stepping forward with a torch in his hand, "does the accused have any last words?" Thomas took a deep breath. He could have exposed Gregory's plot, could have used his gift to reveal every dark secret and hidden sin in the village. But he knew that would only lead to more chaos and pain. Instead, he spoke softly, his words carrying clearly in the tense silence. "I have only ever tried to help this village, to use my gift for good. Whatever happens tonight, know that I forgive you all, and I hope that one day you'll understand the truth." His words seemed to touch something in the crowd. Some people looked away in shame, others shifted uncomfortably. But Gregory, seeing his plan threatening to unravel, quickly moved to light the kindling. As the flames began to lick at the dry wood, spreading quickly towards Thomas, a strange calm came over him. He closed his giant eyes, thinking of all the good he had done, all the people he had helped. If this was to be his end, he would face it with dignity. The fire roared, the heat intense. The villagers watched in horrified fascination, waiting for the moment when the flames would claim Thomas. But something extraordinary began to happen. As the fire reached Thomas, it seemed to part around him. The flames danced and swirled, creating a barrier that kept him untouched. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Suddenly, a strong wind gusted through the village square, extinguishing the fire as if it were no more than a candle. When the smoke cleared, Thomas stood unharmed, the ropes that had bound him now nothing more than ashes at his feet. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, a child's voice rang out, "It's a miracle." The crowd erupted in a mixture of cheers, cries of relief, and exclamations of awe. People rushed forward to embrace Thomas, to beg for forgiveness, to touch the boy who had been saved by divine intervention. In the chaos, Gregory and his conspirators tried to slip away, but Thomas's voice rang out, clear and strong. "Stop them, they are the true criminals." With his gift of sight stronger than ever, Thomas revealed the full extent of Gregory's plots and corruptions. He described in detail how Gregory and his allies had orchestrated not only the attack on Sarah but years of theft, manipulation, and cruelty. Faced with the undeniable truth and witnessing the miracle of Thomas's survival, the villagers turned on Gregory and his co-conspirators. They were quickly apprehended, to be sent to the city for trial and punishment. As the night wore on and the excitement began to die down, Thomas found himself by the river once again. He knelt by the water's edge, his heart full of gratitude. "Thank you, Old Father Thames," he whispered. "I understand now the true purpose of your gift." The water rippled gently in response, and Thomas smiled. He knew that his journey was far from over. There were still 10 years before he would have to return to the river god, and he intended to use every moment to help his village and beyond. Little did he know that the greatest challenges, and the truest tests of his gift, were yet to come. In the years following his trial by fire, Thomas's reputation grew exponentially. No longer feared or doubted by his own people, he became known far and wide as the seer with the giant eyes. People traveled from distant lands to seek his counsel, and his village prospered from the influx of visitors. Thomas, now in his mid-20s, used his gift tirelessly to help those in need. He solved long-standing mysteries, reunited lost loved ones, and even helped neighboring villages resolve conflicts peacefully. His giant eyes, once a source of fear and suspicion, were now seen as a mark of divine favor. However, with great power came great responsibility, and Thomas often found himself exhausted by the constant demands on his abilities. He began to understand the true weight of his gift and the price he would eventually have to pay. One autumn day, as golden leaves fell from the trees, a group of strangers arrived in the village. They were led by a man named Edward, who claimed to be an ambassador from the kingdom's capital. Edward was tall and imposing, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that sparkled with intelligence. "We've come to seek the seer's help," Edward announced to the village elders. "The king himself has sent us. A great evil threatens our land, and we believe only Thomas can help us uncover its source." Thomas, who was present at the meeting, felt a chill run down his spine. His gift allowed him to see that Edward was not being entirely truthful, but he couldn't discern the full extent of the man's intentions. Despite his reservations, Thomas agreed to help. He knew that if there was indeed a threat to the kingdom, he had a duty to do what he could to stop it. The journey to the capital took several days. As they traveled, Thomas used his gift to peer into the hearts and minds of Edward and his companions. He saw flashes of secret meetings, hushed conversations, and a sense of urgency that seemed at odds with their outward calm. Upon reaching the capital, Thomas was immediately struck by the grandeur of the city. Tall spires reached towards the sky, markets bustled with activity, and the streets were filled with people from all walks of life. Edward led Thomas to the royal palace, a sprawling structure of marble and gold. As they approached the throne room, Thomas's gift revealed something that made his blood run cold. Behind the ornate doors, he could see not a benevolent king, but a dark and twisted figure surrounded by cowled figures. Before Thomas could react, Edward and his men suddenly grabbed him. "I'm sorry, sire," Edward said, his voice tinged with regret. "But the king demands your gift for himself." Thomas was brought before the king, who revealed himself to be the leader of the very cult he had helped expose years ago in his village. The king, whose true name was Damien, had been secretly rebuilding his power base, using the resources of the kingdom to further his dark agenda. "Your eyes will be the key to our ultimate victory," Damien gloated. "With your power of sight, we will be unstoppable." But Damien had underestimated Thomas. Even bound and surrounded by enemies, the seer's gift was powerful. He looked deep into Damien's past, uncovering every dark secret, every weakness. "Your reign of terror ends now," Thomas declared, his voice ringing with authority. He began to speak, revealing Damien's crimes to all present, the guards, the servants, even Damien's own cult members. As Thomas spoke, his eyes began to glow with an unearthly light. The truth of his words was undeniable, and one by one, those in the throne room began to turn against Damien. Chaos erupted in the palace. Guards who had been loyal to the crown now fought against the cult members. Edward, realizing the magnitude of his mistake, cut Thomas's bonds and begged for forgiveness. In the midst of the fighting, Damien attempted to flee. But Thomas, his gift stronger than ever, tracked the false king's every move. He led a group of loyal guards through secret passages and hidden rooms, finally cornering Damien in the palace's highest tower. Realizing he was trapped, Damien snarled at Thomas. "You fool, you have no idea of the powers you're meddling with. The dark gods will punish you for this interference." Thomas stood tall, his giant eyes glowing with righteous power. "Your dark gods have no power here," he said calmly. "The truth is the strongest magic of all." With those words, a blinding light erupted from Thomas's eyes, engulfing Damien. When it faded, the false king was gone, leaving behind nothing but a pile of ash. In the days that followed, Thomas helped the kingdom transition to a new, just rule. He used his gift to identify those who had been loyal to Damien and those who had been coerced or tricked into serving him. His fair judgments and kind heart won him the love and respect of the entire kingdom. As Thomas prepared to return to his village, now hailed as a hero throughout the land, he couldn't help but feel a sense of melancholy. He was nearing his 30th year, and the promise made to Old Father Thames weighed heavily on his mind. But there was still work to be done, still people who needed his help. Thomas squared his shoulders and set his gaze towards home, ready to make the most of the time he had left. Little did he know that his greatest challenge, and the true test of his character, still lay ahead. As Thomas approached his 30th year, a sense of urgency filled his days. He worked tirelessly, using his gift to help as many people as he could. His fame had spread far and wide, and people from all corners of the kingdom sought his counsel. Despite the adoration he received, Thomas never married or fathered children. He knew that his time was limited, and he didn't want to leave behind a family who would mourn his departure. This decision often left him feeling lonely, but he found solace in the good he was able to do. On the eve of his 30th birthday, Thomas gathered the villagers to make an announcement. Standing before them, his giant eyes glistening with unshed tears, he revealed the truth about his gift and the promise made to Old Father Thames. "Tomorrow, I must return to the river," he said, his voice strong despite his heavy heart. "My time among you has been the greatest blessing I could have asked for. I hope that the lessons we've learned together will guide you in the years to come." The villagers were stunned. Many cried out in dismay, begging Thomas to stay. His parents, Mary and John, held each other, their faces etched with sorrow but also pride for their extraordinary son. As the sun rose on Thomas's 30th birthday, the entire village accompanied him to the river's edge. The water was calm, reflecting the pink and gold of the dawn sky. Thomas turned to face his people one last time. "Remember," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd, "the true power of sight lies not in the eyes, but in the heart. Look out for one another. Seek the truth, even when it's difficult. And above all, be kind." With those final words, Thomas waded into the river. As the water rose around him, his body began to glow with a soft light. The villagers watched in awe as Thomas's form shimmered and then dissolved into thousands of points of light that danced across the water's surface before sinking beneath the waves. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, a deep voice echoed across the river, "Well done, my son. Your time among mortals is over, but your legacy will live on." The villagers stood in reverent silence, many wiping tears from their eyes. They knew they had witnessed something truly miraculous. In the years that followed, the village continued to prosper. The lessons Thomas had taught them about truth, kindness, and justice guided their actions. They established a council of elders to make fair decisions, and they welcomed strangers with open arms, remembering how their fear had once led them to mistrust Thomas. However, as time passed and new generations were born, the memory of Thomas began to fade. The story of the boy with giant eyes became a legend, told around firesides but no longer believed as literal truth. Slowly, old habits began to creep back into the village. Corruption seeped into the council of elders. Neighbors began to distrust one another. The lessons Thomas had taught were forgotten. It was then that the river began to stir once more. Old Father Thames, seeing the village falling back into darkness, knew it was time for a new champion to arise. One night, a young woman named Lily found herself drawn to the river's edge. As she knelt by the water, she heard a voice speaking to her, offering her a gift, and a choice. Lily listened to the voice, her heart pounding with excitement and fear. She thought of the legends she'd heard about Thomas, the boy with giant eyes who had brought justice and kindness to the village so long ago. Taking a deep breath, Lily made her decision. "I accept," she said firmly. As the words left her lips, she felt a tingling sensation in her hands. She looked down to see her palms beginning to glow with an inner light. She knew, somehow, that she now had the power to heal with a touch and to see the truth in people's hearts. Lily stood up, her new gift filling her with purpose. She knew the challenges that lay ahead would be great, but she was ready to face them. Just as Thomas had done before her, she would use her gift to bring light to the darkness and hope to those in need. As Lily walked back to the village, the river rippled gently behind her. And if one listened closely, they might have heard a faint chuckle on the wind. Old Father Thames, watching over his chosen ones, guiding the village's destiny from the depths of his watery domain. The cycle had begun anew, and the legacy of the giant-eyed boy lived on, not in his eyes, but in the hearts of those who chose to see the world with kindness, truth, and justice.